While everyone is talking about how powerful the youth vote was in 2023, nobody is asking a far more uncomfortable question: why that same energy may never return in 2027. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the excitement, beneath the record-breaking voter registrations, something didn't quite add up. Millions of young Nigerians registered to vote for the first time. Social media was flooded with political engagement. The sense of momentum felt undeniable. And yet, when it mattered most, turnout in key areas still fell short of expectations. So the real question is not whether the youth showed up in 2023. The real question is this: was 2023 the beginning of something, or was it the peak? And what if, rather than awakening a new political generation, 2023 quietly planted a more dangerous idea: that the system, no matter how much energy is poured into it, cannot be changed? Before we go further, if you are new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you are from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Now, to understand where 2027 is heading, we have to go back to 2023. Not just what happened on election day, but what happened in the minds of voters before and after it. Because 2023 was, without question, a turning point. For the first time in years, there was a visible surge in youth voter registration. Young Nigerians were not just talking about politics, they were organizing around it. Campaigns moved from traditional spaces into digital platforms. Messaging became faster, more direct, and more emotionally resonant. In urban centers especially, the sense of political awakening was hard to ignore. But elections are not won on social media. They are won through a combination of turnout, structure, and control of process. And this is where the contrast began to emerge. While urban youth participation increased, rural voting patterns remained largely consistent. Established political structures, ground networks, local alliances, long-standing influence continued to operate with efficiency. So what looked like a surge on one level was on another level a partial shift within a much larger system. Then came the aftermath: legal battles, disputes, extended uncertainty, competing narratives about credibility and transparency. And slowly, almost quietly, something began to change. The emotional arc shifted from hope to frustration to something more complex: disengagement. Not loud, not immediate, but gradual. And if you look at Nigeria's electoral history, this pattern is not entirely new. Since 2011, youth political engagement has often followed a cycle: initial enthusiasm followed by declining participation when expectations collide with institutional realities. Which brings us to a critical question that will define 2027. If youth turnout drops, is that apathy, or is it a rational political decision? Because people don't withdraw from systems randomly. They withdraw when they begin to question whether their participation actually changes outcomes. And to answer that, we have to move beyond voter enthusiasm and examine the system itself. At the center of every election are institutions: election management bodies, legal frameworks, operational processes. On paper, these systems are designed to ensure fairness, transparency, and credibility. In practice, they operate within constraints. Logistical challenges, accreditation delays, transmission issues, collation complexities can shape not just outcomes, but perceptions of those outcomes. And perception in politics is almost as powerful as reality. The legal framework also plays a role here. Reforms have been introduced, electoral laws have evolved, expectations have increased, but there remains a gap between what is written and what is experienced on election day. And within that gap lies ambiguity. Ambiguity in how processes are executed, ambiguity in how compliance is interpreted, ambiguity in how results are communicated. Now, here is the uncomfortable reality. High voter registration does not guarantee high voter influence. Participation does not automatically translate into power. And once that realization begins to settle in, it changes how people approach future elections. Because if institutions define the limits of participation, then political actors define how those limits are used. And this is where strategy becomes critical. In 2023, youth participation reshaped the conversation, but it did not fully reshape the structure. New political movements gained visibility. They influenced national discourse. They altered campaign strategies. But established political actors did something equally important. They adapted without surrendering their structural advantages. Ground networks remained intact. Regional alliances held. Institutional familiarity continued to matter. So, moving toward 2027, the strategic question is no longer just how to mobilize voters. It is how to operate within and sometimes around the system that defines outcomes. Now, think about who benefits if youth engagement declines. Reform-driven candidates, those who rely heavily on new voters, issue-based campaigns, and momentum, face the greatest risk because their strength is participation. Reduce participation, and their influence weakens. On the other hand, political structures that are less dependent on enthusiasm and more dependent on organization become more effective in low turnout environments. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Because beyond visible actors, there are also silent stakeholders, political financiers, regional power blocks, institutional gatekeepers. These are not always seen in campaign rallies or online debates, but they shape the environment in which elections take place. And their calculations are often long-term. Here's the second shift you need to understand. The real contest in 2027 may not be between parties, but between turnout levels. Because turnout determines whose strategy works. High turnout favors momentum, low turnout favors structure. And once you see it that way, a more difficult question emerges. What if the biggest political strategy in 2027 is not mobilizing voters, but discouraging them? Not through direct instruction, but through environment, through uncertainty, through loss of trust, through the slow erosion of belief that participation leads to change. And if that happens, then what we are dealing with is no longer just politics. It becomes a national issue. Because when a significant portion of the youth population begins to disengage politically, the effects ripple outward. At the federal and state level, reduced youth turnout strengthens existing power structures. It lowers the pressure for reform. It stabilizes the status quo, not necessarily through consensus, but through absence of challenge. Economically, the consequences are just as significant. A politically disengaged youth population is less likely to feel represented in policy decisions. That disconnect can reinforce existing frustrations, especially around employment, opportunity, and inclusion. And over time, that creates a feedback loop. Disengagement leads to less influence leads to less responsive policy, and less responsive policy leads to deeper disengagement. Socially, the risk is a widening divide, not just between regions, but between generations. A perception can emerge that political outcomes are decided without meaningful input from younger citizens. And once that perception takes hold, rebuilding trust becomes far more difficult. Now, here's the part many people overlook. A disengaged youth population does not create stability. It creates silent instability. Because political energy does not disappear, it shifts. When it no longer flows through formal systems like elections, it begins to find other outlets. Some of those outlets are constructive, others are not. And that creates a different kind of national risk, one that is harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Which leads us to a final transition. When internal political participation begins to weaken, external actors start paying closer attention. Because in today's world, democracy is not just a domestic issue. It is part of how nations are perceived, engaged with, and positioned globally. And that opens an entirely new dimension of what the youth vote in 2027 really represents. Not just participation, but legitimacy. Now, looking beyond Nigeria's borders, the international dimension adds another layer to this story. Western governments, for example, often prioritize electoral stability over participation levels. In other words, it matters to them that the process is orderly, even if turnout is uneven, because stability underpins economic and diplomatic confidence. For Nigeria, however, that means the credibility of our democracy is judged not just internally, but externally. Low youth turnout can subtly affect how investors, partners, and foreign governments perceive the strength of our political institutions. And then there's the diaspora. In 2023, Nigerians abroad were highly engaged. Social media campaigns, town halls in London, New York, and Washington, they were watching and commenting, actively shaping conversations back home. Yet, while remittances flow back to Nigeria in billions, political influence remains limited. The gap between financial contribution and electoral impact is stark, and it shapes perceptions of how meaningful participation really is. This is part of a broader global pattern. Across the world, youth in democracies are increasingly disillusioned. From the streets of Paris to the suburbs of the United States, young people question whether casting a ballot truly affects outcomes. Nigeria is not unique in facing this challenge, but the stakes here are amplified by our size, diversity, and historical weight of each electoral cycle. But not everyone agrees that youth disengagement is necessarily a problem. Some argue the youth will return stronger in 2027. Enthusiasm is cyclical. It will rebound. Yet, enthusiasm alone cannot overcome structural barriers. Registration is one thing. Credible, accessible, and efficient electoral processes are another. Without trust in the system, enthusiasm can dissipate quickly. Others point to 2023 as proof of progress, proof that participation can change outcomes. But participation without sustained institutional trust may not be durable. One election cycle, even a high-profile one, does not guarantee a generational shift in behavior. And there's a common misconception that low turnout equals apathy. The reality is more nuanced. Low participation may reflect strategic withdrawal, a rational, informed decision that the system is not responsive rather than simple disinterest. From a national interest perspective, the key question is not whether one region or one group benefits. It is whether Nigeria maintains a participatory democratic culture across North, South, East, and West. If that foundation erodes, every Nigerian loses, not just politically, but economically and socially. Looking ahead to 2027, several strategic scenarios emerge. Scenario 1. Youth resurgence. Better coordination, smarter campaigns, and stronger alignment with structural realities could produce record turnout, energizing reforms and injecting new momentum into national politics. Scenario 2. Gradual disengagement. A continuation of current trends would see youth influence diminish, leaving traditional political actors to dominate and the status quo to harden. Scenario 3. Shift to alternative political expression. If formal channels are seen as ineffective, energy may move into activism outside the ballot box, social movements, online campaigns, or even unstructured forms of civic participation. What should we watch for as signals of which path Nigeria is taking? Voter registration trends versus actual turnout will tell us a lot. Messaging from major parties, whether they appeal to issues, identity, or nostalgia, will indicate how much effort is being made to re-engage young voters. And any meaningful institutional reforms or the lack thereof will either encourage or discourage participation. Escalation signals may be subtle but critical. A decline in youth-focused campaigns, an increased reliance on traditional political structures, or messaging that implicitly dampens participation can all be warning signs. The long-term impact is clear. These patterns will define the credibility of Nigeria's democracy for the next generation. They will determine whether political renewal is possible or whether power concentrates in the hands of the few. So we return to the core question we opened with. Was 2023 the start of a movement or its peak? The measured answer is this. The youth vote in 2027 will not depend on enthusiasm alone. It will depend on whether participation is perceived as meaningful. If young Nigerians see that casting a vote matters, turnout will respond.
If they believe the system is rigged, opaque, or unresponsive, participation will fall, and with it, influence and power concentrate elsewhere. And that is the fundamental lesson for 2027. Belief in the system is not optional, it is the currency of democracy. When belief declines, turnout follows, and when turnout falls, the balance of power shifts. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching.